All right, welcome back. This is week 4, part 2, getting started with our content for the week centered around two big topics. First, the affective domain, and second, getting started with your student. There are 5 objectives for this week. First, to be able to explain the 4 components of the affective domain. Obviously, you need to be able to do that if you are going to assess this domain. Second, you're going to need to develop your weekly assessment plan for the first session. Third, administer diagnostics for the affective domain. Fourth, analyze those assessment results. And lastly, plan next steps or recommendations for your student based on what you're seeing in those assessment results. All right, the affective domain. For students to become lifelong readers, they must have both the skill and the will to read. And that is really our job as educators and teachers of reading, not only to develop their skills, but also their will to read. Why is the will important? Well, reading for pleasure correlates strongly with academic achievement. Students who engage in pleasure reading are better readers than non-readers. This reminds me of the Matthew effect, a term coined by Stanovich, which essentially says that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and it applies to reading as well, where you have students who are motivated are reading more often and as a result are reinforced to read more often for pleasure and also develop vocabulary quicker. They build their comprehension skills, schema, everything. Whereas those students lacking the motivation are then not reading as often and are not getting all of those benefits of reading. So it is definitely very important for us to not only develop the skill, but also the will and the motivation to read. And I would argue that that is the most important thing we do, which is why this is the first domain we are focusing on. So what does it include? It includes 4 pieces. First, motivation and engagement. Second, the student's attitude toward reading. Third, their reading interests. And fourth, their confidence in reading and their self-perception. So with motivation and engagement, there are actually 2 types of reluctant readers. First, you have those who struggle to read. I think when you hear reluctant reader, that's what comes to mind most often, but it also includes those who can read but choose not to. For whatever reason, they are not motivated to read, and it's not because they're frustrated and can't read, but they aren't motivated to read. Reluctant readers typically have little intrinsic motivation. You might have heard of the terms intrinsic and extrinsic before. Someone who is intrinsically motivated is motivated by an internal drive, whereas someone who is extrinsically motivated needs some sort of external or tangible reward in order to reinforce a certain behavior. So for a reluctant reader, you may need to start out using extrinsic levers as motivators, free pizza, coupons, stickers, certificates, small prizes, trinkets, tokens, what have you. But eventually, we need to replace the extrinsic levers with intrinsic motivation and wean those students off because it actually can be quite damaging to their motivation to read if they're only doing it for an extrinsic reward instead of seeing the value and developing their internal drive. The next piece for the affective domain is the student's attitude toward reading. An attitude is actually different from motivation. It kind of seems like they would be similar, but let me give you an example. You can have a positive attitude about something, but not be motivated to do it. For example, my workout schedule and gym life. I have a positive attitude when I'm doing it and I know it's good for me and I know I should work out, get some cardio in, but I'm not always very motivated to do it. In fact, I even made an extrinsic reward system for myself to help me be more motivated to do that. So, attitude can be different from motivation. In contrast, you might have students who are very motivated to do something. They do have that intrinsic motivation, but at the same time, they might not necessarily like or enjoy or have a positive attitude about what they're doing. But because they have that internal motivation, they are committed to complete the task, whether or not they enjoy it or have a positive attitude about that. So hopefully you kind of see the difference there between attitude and motivation and how it is possible to have one and not the other, which is why we want to give assessments that indicate which area our student needs some support in. So most students have a negative attitude toward reading because it's difficult for them. Therefore, we need to develop positive experiences with reading to revert that negative attitude. It's important to listen to your student and observe them to find out exactly what's causing the negative attitude, and that's what you're going to be doing this first session with your student. All right, next component of the affective domain are reading interests. What genres does your student like to read about? Which topics do they like to read about? What modality do they like to read in? Do they like to read aloud? Do they like to read silently in a group setting with a friend, with a family member? Students develop interest in topics that they want to learn more about, and that's a way to often engage a reluctant reader is to get them to read a topic that they are interested in, and oftentimes they're more motivated to read about a topic they are interested in, so they can even read beyond their zone of proximal development sometimes if you give them a text that they're very interested in. Familiarity can also be a contributing factor to interests in reading. So, something they already know a lot about, they might want to read about that because they have that schema and they have that background knowledge. A difficulty with this area is that interests are constantly changing. I think about students I've taught in the past, one day something's in or cool, the next day it's not. One day, they want to be this when they grow up, the next day it's something completely different. They are constantly changing their minds and changing their interests, so that presents some difficulty. And then when students spend time reading text interesting to them, they spend more time reading. I was just, discussing the fact that when you do match them with a text that they are interested in, they will often put in more effort to read that text. And I read, I think it was in the Read Aloud handbook I read this summer, where Jim Trelease, the author, talks about how teachers need to be matchmakers. It was either in that or Read Aside, another great book I read this summer, but essentially how the teacher is a matchmaker trying to find the perfect pairing of student with text. And I just thought that was so true. All right, and the last piece in the affective domain is self-confidence. Confidence is the belief that you can succeed. It is a key factor in motivation. Oftentimes, if you don't have confidence in something, you are not going to be motivated to make an attempt to do that. So not only do you need to have a value in the task you're doing, but you need to have a feeling of success as well, and those go hand in hand with motivation. Students need to experience success with reading, or else that negative self-perception, negative attitude is going to be reinforced. Teachers should design an environment that intentionally builds student self-worth. So you never want to intentionally put your student in a frustrating situation with text, you need to be very intentional about the text you're selecting, the activities you're designing, so that your student will always feel successful. So our assessment choices for the affective domain, so the motivation to read profile is required, and that is because it assesses all four areas just discussed in one handy dandy assessment. You are able to gauge their reading interest through the conversational interview. It also measures their self-confidence, self-perception, in addition to their motivation and their attitude. Limitation of this is, it is a self-report, so whether or not it's reliable is difficult to tell, so you will need to triangulate it with other assessments. Another popular assessment for the affective domain is the Reading Attitude Survey, which features the Garfield character. It's even norm referenced, which is kind of exciting because you can compare your student to peers and see how they do. Basically, there is a statement about the student's attitude towards reading, and they circle the Garfield character that shows their attitude for that statement in particular. It is a Likert scale, 1 through 4, where there's a Garfield character, showing a gradation from 1 through 4. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between a few of them, and even I think 2 and 3, Garfield number 2 and 3, and even explain to the student the difference between those Garfield characters. But this is, more younger student centered and is more appealing to those younger students, which is kind of nice because it has the character on there for them. Also, there are interest inventories. You could do about me or experience inventories to help you gauge what would be the perfect text to match your student with that they might be interested in reading. And then lastly, our self-perception skills. So these are the different types of assessments you can use for the affective domain. We are giving the MRP because it does help you to examine all four of those areas within the affective domain. So what can you do as an educator to motivate students, give them a positive attitude about reading? Well, first, you need to value reading in the classroom. You need to be a reading role model, share what you're reading, your reading habits, share books you enjoy. You can even schedule guest speakers to serve as reading role models, parents, friends, family. You can have them rate and recommend books to each other. Introduce students to interesting literature. Humorous and thought-provoking books are often popular. And then help students set and achieve reading goals. And that is part of that self-perception and self-confidence. You want to help them to set incremental goals that they will be successful achieving quickly. And then once they have that first initial taste of success, they're more likely to input more work and effort the next time around. So you want something that's very measurable that they can achieve reasonably quickly so that they are motivated to continue. All right, let's take a break there and come back and finish up with some reminders for your first session with your student.